Hello, my dear listeners. I'm your host on this journey through the darkest and most fascinating pages of human history. Today, we're going to dive into a narrative that challenges our understanding of the limits of power and human cruelty. You're about to discover a story that will make you question everything you think you know about freedom, fear, and social control. Imagine for a moment living in a place where a simple conversation on the street corner could result in literally losing your tongue, where every word spoken in secret could be your last. Could you survive in a society where silence was the only guarantee of safety? This isn't a rhetorical question, my friends. It's the terrifying reality we're going to explore today. Forget everything you think you know about freedom of speech. We're diving into an era where desperate rulers created the cruelest anti-gossip law ever recorded in history. Get ready to learn about a city where terror reigned supreme and where even a glance could be interpreted as treason. Ever thought about how nice it would be if there was a law against gossip? Be careful what you wish for. We're going to explore a time when that law actually existed. And believe me, you'll be horrified by the methods used to enforce it. Prepare yourself for a story that will make you treasure every word. You can speak freely. The story I'm telling you today isn't fiction. It's a documented account of how an entire city was silenced by fear, where whispers could cost lives, and where gossip became a crime punishable by mutilation. You'll discover how a draconian law transformed ordinary citizens into mute statues, living in constant terror of uttering a single word out of place. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to hit that like button, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any episodes. Your engagement is crucial for us to continue bringing these extraordinary stories to you. Now, take a deep breath and prepare for a journey that will change your perspective on the value of the spoken word. Our story unfolds in the city-state of Silentopolis in the 16th century. During a period of extreme political instability, the region was constantly threatened by internal revolts and external invasions, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust that permeated all aspects of social life. The local ruler, Lord Mutilus Vox, had seized power after a series of political assassinations that decimated the traditional nobility. Lord Vox was a man obsessed with total control. He firmly believed that information was the most powerful weapon that existed, capable of toppling empires and destroying dynasties. He had witnessed firsthand how rumors and gossip had contributed to the downfall of his predecessors, and he was determined not to allow the same fate to befall him. His philosophy was simple and brutal. If people couldn't speak, they couldn't conspire against him. The catalyst for creating the law happened during what became known as the Royal Bakery Incident. A young woman named Isabella Moretti, daughter of a local baker, had witnessed a conversation between two court nobles. They were openly discussing plans to assassinate Lord Vox during the harvest festival, placing him with a distant cousin who had been exiled years before. Isabella, driven by youthful naivety and perhaps a distorted sense of civic duty, decided to share this information with her best friend, who in turn told her mother, who whispered it to a neighbor while buying vegetables at the market. Within hours, the entire city knew about the conspiracy plans. What should have been a secret plot had become public knowledge through the informal communication network that existed among the citizens. When the news reached Lord Vox's ears, its reaction was one of uncontrollable fury, not just because there had been a conspiracy against his life, but mainly because of how easily the information had spread. He realized that regardless of how many conspirators he executed, there would always be the possibility of new plans emerging and spreading in the same way. It was then that Vox summoned his closest advisors for an emergency meeting. For 3 days and 3 nights, they crafted what would become known as the Law of Perpetual Silence. The legislation was detailed and comprehensive, covering everything from casual conversations to whispers between spouses. Any exchange of information that wasn't strictly necessary for the basic functioning of society would be considered a crime. The established penalties were graduated, but all extremely severe. The first offense would result in a fine equivalent to 6 months' salary. The second offense would mean 1 year in prison and permanent facial branding with a hot iron. The third offense would be punished with complete tongue removal, formed publicly as an example to the entire population. And there was no possible appeal, and accusations could be made anonymously. The law was presented to the people during a mandatory assembly in the city's central square. Lord Fox, wearing his finest clothes and surrounded by armed guards, personally read each article of the new legislation. The silence that followed wasn't one of approval, but of absolute terror. People finally understood that their lives had changed forever, and that from that moment on, every word had the potential to become their last. The implementation of the law of silence required the creation of a completely new and terrifying administrative structure. Lord Fox established the Linguistic Surveillance Corps, a paramilitary organization composed of individuals specially trained to detect, investigate, and punish violations of the new law. These men, popularly known as gossip hunters, became the most feared figures in the city. Recruitment for the corps was done among convicted criminals who accepted service in exchange for clemency. They underwent intensive training that included interrogation techniques, psychological torture methods, and, most disturbingly, basic medical procedures necessary to perform the mutilations prescribed by law. They were taught to read lips, interpret body language, detect signs of nonverbal communication. The leader of the corps was a man known only as the Cutter. His real name remained secret. It was said that he had lost his own tongue in battle years before, which made him peculiarly suited for the position. He carried with him a kit of surgical instruments made especially for penalty executions, including heated tongs, curved blades, and cauterizers to stop bleeding. To ensure effective law enforcement, a network of spies and informants was established that permeated all aspects of society. Neighbors were encouraged to report on neighbors, employees to inform on their bosses, and even children were incentivized to report suspicious conversations in their homes. A financial reward system made informing not just an act of civic loyalty, but also a source of income for the most desperate. The first penalty executions happened, surprise, 1 week after the law's enactment. The first case was of a merchant named Pietro Linguini, who had been reported for commenting to a customer that grain prices were too high. The formal charge was dissemination of potentially seditious information about governmental, economic policies. Pietro tried to argue that it was just a casual business observation, but the law made no distinctions between intentions. The penalty execution was carried out in the central square, with a mandatory attendance by all citizens. Pietro was tied to a wooden table, specially built for the procedure. The Cutter, wearing a black leather mask, approached with his tongs heated until they were red hot. The procedure lasted approximately 15 minutes, during which Pietro's screams echoed throughout the entire city. When it was all over, his tongue had been completely removed, and he was free to live the rest of his life in perpetual silence. The psychological impact of this first execution was devastating. People began to realize that the law wasn't just an empty threat, but a brutal reality that could reach anyone at any time. Spontaneous conversations completely disappeared from the streets. Markets, which had previously been vibrant places of social exchange, became somber environments where commercial transactions were conducted through gestures and writing. The social transformation was rapid and radical. Family gatherings were canceled for fear that some conversation might be misinterpreted. Weddings were performed in absolute silence, with vows exchanged only through looks and gestures. Even religious services were modified, with sermons being replaced by silent readings of sacred texts. For those clever enough to perceive opportunities, a black market for services related to the new social environment quickly emerged. Tongue guards offered protection during necessary conversations, positioning themselves strategically to detect the presence of spies. Kester, translators, charged high sums to facilitate complex communications between people who could no longer risk speaking. Even forgers began offering documents that supposedly guaranteed special permission for conversations under specific circumstances. The economy of fear had been born, and with it, a new class of exploiters who profited from the terror imposed by the law of silence. The true dimension of the law of silence's cruelty can only be understood through the personal stories of those who were its victims. Each documented case reveals not only the brutality of the methods employed, but also the terrible randomness with which the law was applied, creating an environment where anyone could be the next victim. The most emblematic case was that of Maria Ventuline, a middle-aged woman who worked as a washerwoman for the city's wealthier families. Maria committed the crime of commenting to a client that the weather was particularly rainy that autumn, serving that this was hindering the drying of clothes. The client, fearing being associated with any kind of prohibited conversation, immediately reported Maria to the authorities. During the summary trial, Maria desperately argued that she was merely making an observation about the weather without any political or seditious intention. However, the judges interpreted her comment as indirect criticism of the local administration, since the government was responsible for all economic activities, including those affected by weather conditions. Maria was sentenced to tongue removal, executed 3 days later in front of a silent and terrified crowd. Another case that deeply shocked the community was that of Giuseppe Mercatori, a prosperous merchant who had built his fortune through decades of honest work. Giuseppe made the fatal mistake of whispering to a partner that the prices imposed by the government for certain products were negatively impacting his business. The whisper was heard by one of the Linguistic Surveillance Corps spies, who was disguised as an ordinary customer. Giuseppe not only lost his tongue, but also his entire fortune, which was confiscated by the state as profits obtained through seditious activities. His family was banished from the city, and his children were forced to grow up knowing that their father had been mutilated for simply expressing a legitimate business concern. The punishment methods evolved and became progressively more sophisticated and cruel. The cutter developed different techniques depending on the perceived severity of the crime. For minor offenses, he performed partial cuts that left part of the tongue intact but severely damaged, resulting in permanently distorted speech that served as a constant reminder of the punishment. For crimes considered more serious, the removal was complete, performed with instruments that ensured regeneration would be impossible. The public ritual of penalty executions became a macabre spectacle that the entire population was forced to witness. The cutter had transformed these occasions into elaborate theatrical performances, using different instruments and techniques to maximize both the victim's suffering and the psychological impact on spectators. Kay developed a specific protocol that included speeches about the dangers of gossip, public readings of crimes committed, and finally, the execution of the mutilation itself. Resistance groups tried to form, but the nature of the law made any organization practically impossible. How could people who couldn't speak to each other conspire? Some tried to develop complex gestural codes, but even these were eventually detected and punished. A particularly brave attempt involved a group of women who tried to organize a revolt through codes embroidered on clothing. But one of the participants was discovered and the entire network was dismantled. The impact on children was perhaps the most devastating of all the law's effects. An entire generation grew up never having experienced natural freedom of expression. Children learned to communicate through looks and gestures, developing a sophisticated nonverbal language that their parents could barely understand. Many developed developmental problems related to the forced suppression of verbal communication, including chronic anxiety, depression, behavioral disorders. The local school was transformed into an institution of silent education, where lessons were taught exclusively through written texts and visual demonstrations. Teachers used elaborate symbol systems to transmit knowledge, and students responded through standardized writing or gestures. The intellectual development of an entire generation was severely compromised by the impossibility of participating in open discussions and verbal questioning. Collective paranoia reached levels that completely transformed the city's social fabric. Neighbors who had been friends for decades began avoiding each other, fearing that any interaction could be misinterpreted. Families fragmented when members began suspecting each other of being potential informants. Marriages were destroyed by the impossibility of intimate communication, and many couples developed relationships based purely on gestures and writing, completely losing the emotional intimacy that comes with spontaneous conversation. The resulting psychological isolation created an epidemic of mental illnesses that the era's doctors couldn't understand or treat. Many people developed what we would now recognize as severe depression, generalized anxiety, and even suicidal tendencies. Some citizens began talking to themselves at home, whispering to walls just to hear the sound of their own voices, constantly risking being discovered by vigilant neighbors. Daily life in a city governed by the law of silence required extraordinary adaptations that completely transformed the basic human experience of living in society. Every aspect of daily existence, from the simplest commercial transactions to the most sacred rituals, had to be reimagined in a world where words had become mortally dangerous. Commerce, the backbone of any prosperous community, developed a complex system of nonverbal communication that bordered on the absurd. Merchants created elaborate signs with prices and product descriptions, but even these had to be carefully written to avoid any language that could be interpreted as criticism or social commentary. Customers pointed to desired items, showed coins to indicate offers, and used standardized gestures to express satisfaction or dissatisfaction with products. Bargaining, millennial commercial tradition, became impossible. The negotiation process, which previously depended on verbal argumentation and persuasion, was replaced by a rigid system of fixed prices. This resulted in a less dynamic and flexible economy, where innovation and adaptation were severely limited by the SEN's impossibility of open discussion about market needs and opportunities. Professions that depended on verbal communication were completely transformed or disappeared. Lawyers, previously respected figures in the community, found themselves practically useless in a system where oral argumentation was impossible. Some tried to adapt by offering legal writing services, but even this was limited by the need to avoid any language that could be considered controversial. Teachers developed teaching methods based purely on demonstration and imitation, completely eliminating the Socratic discussion and critical questioning that are fundamental to effective learning. The psychological effects of forced silence manifested in surprising and disturbing ways. Studies conducted decades later by doctors from other regions revealed that the population had developed a collective form of trauma that affected not only individuals, but the entire social structure. Many people began presenting physical symptoms related to communication suppression, including chronic muscle tension in the jaw and throat, persistent headaches, and stress-related digestive disorders. The incidence of mental illness increased dramatically. Depression, anxiety, and compulsive behaviors became epidemic. Some people developed a condition that the era's doctors called whisper madness, where individuals began mumbling uncontrollably to themselves, apparently unable to stop the flow of repressed words. These cases invariably ended in imprisonment or mutilation, creating a vicious cycle of repression and mental deterioration. Fear had become second nature to the city's inhabitants, but small children learned before anything else to remain silent. Mothers developed elaborate methods of nonverbal communication with their babies, using touches, facial expressions, and body movements to transmit love and affection. However, the absence of lullabies told stories, and loving conversations had profound impacts on children's emotional development. Paradoxically, the economy of fear created opportunities for some unscrupulous entrepreneurs. An entire industry of services related to silent living emerged. Gesture interpreters charged high fees to facilitate complex communications between people who could no longer risk speaking. Conversation guards offered protection during absolutely necessary discussions, positioning themselves strategically to detect spies and signal danger. A black market developed for safe spaces, places supposedly protected from surveillance, where desperate people paid fortunes for a few minutes of free conversation. These establishments, usually located in basements or abandoned buildings, offered the illusion of freedom of expression, but were frequently elaborate traps operated by government agents themselves to capture law violators. The exceptions too. The rule revealed the arbitrary and hypocritical nature of the system. Lord Fox and his closest courtiers maintained the right to speak freely among themselves, justifying this as necessary for government functioning. Certain professionals, such as doctors in emergency situations and military commanders during operations, received limited special permissions for verbal communication, but always under strict supervision. A complex hierarchy of the right to speak developed. Lesser nobles could whisper among themselves about approved subjects. Wealthy merchants could buy temporary licenses for specific business discussions. Priests were allowed to recite prayers and perform ceremonies, but any deviation from approved texts resulted in immediate punishment. This hierarchy created deep resentment among social classes. Those who had speaking privileges, even limited ones, were simultaneously envied and despised by the forcibly silenced. This led to even greater social fragmentation, where the ability to speak became not just a privilege, but a status symbol that divided the community into rigidly defined castes. The cruel irony was that even among the privileged who could speak, the constant fear of saying something wrong created a self-censorship that was almost as effective as the law itself. Conversations among nobles became careful exercises in diplomacy, that every word was weighed and measured before being spoken. Spontaneity, creativity, and genuine intimacy disappeared even among those who theoretically had permission to express themselves. After years of brutal implementation, the law of silence began showing signs of unsustainability that even Lord Fox hadn't foreseen. Problems started manifesting at practical and administrative levels that threatened the very basic functioning of the society the law was meant to protect. The first significant sign of weakness appeared in government administration itself. The impossibility of effective communication between public officials began creating catastrophic bureaucratic bottlenecks. Important decisions were delayed for weeks while the information was transmitted through elaborate systems of written documents. Misinterpretations became common, leading to poorly implemented policies and wasted resources. The judicial system, which depended on the law of silence for its legitimacy, began collapsing under the weight of its own contradiction. Trials became absurd exercises where defendants couldn't defend themselves verbally, lawyers couldn't argue cases, and witnesses couldn't provide oral testimony. Justice, which was already questionable under the authoritarian regime, became completely arbitrary and dysfunctional. Serious economic problems began emerging when other cities and regions started avoiding business with Silentopolis. Outside, merchants found it impossible to conduct complex transactions in an environment where verbal negotiation was prohibited. Gradually, the city began being economically isolated, with devastating consequences for its prosperity and stability. External pressure increased, and leaders of neighboring cities began expressing concern about refugees arriving from Silentopolis. These people, traumatized by constant terror and often physically mutilated, told horrific stories that shocked communities accustomed to more traditional forms of authoritarianism. Some regional governors began considering military intervention to remove Lord Fox from power. Paradoxically, it was organized resistance that finally managed to articulate itself effectively. Despite the tremendous difficulties imposed by the law, a group of women, led by a courageous widow named Katerina Libertus, developed a communication system based on apparently innocent domestic activities. Embroidery patterns, flower arrangements, and even the way clothes were hung to dry carried coded messages. Katerina had lost her husband to the law of silence. He had been mutilated for commenting that he missed the conversations they used to have during meals. Her personal pain transformed into revolutionary determination. She realized that women, traditionally ignored by the political system, had a unique advantage. Their domestic activities were considered too mundane to attract attention from authorities. The code developed by the women was incredibly sophisticated. Different types of stitches represented different types of information. Thread colors indicated urgency. The location of embroidery on clothing pieces communicated specific instructions for action. Even floral arrangements in windows carried messages about guard movements, patrol schedules, and opportunities for secret meetings. The first silent demonstrations were subtle but powerful. Women began gathering in public squares, apparently for normal activities like sewing or childcare, but actually coordinating resistance. They developed almost imperceptible hand signals that allowed quick communication, even in the presence of spies. The breakthrough came when the group managed to establish contact with discontented officials within the government itself. Some members of the Linguistic Surveillance Corps, horrified by the brutality they were forced to implement, secretly began providing information about planned operations and target lists. This intelligence allowed many people to avoid capture and the resistance network to expand without detection. The event that led to the regime's final downfall happened during what should have been a routine public execution. A young woman named Sophia, vocalist, had been condemned for singing a lullaby to her sick baby Anne, act considered unauthorized dissemination of verbal content. When the cutter approached to perform the mutilation, something extraordinary happened. Katerina Libertus, who had strategically positioned women throughout the mandatory crowd, gave an almost imperceptible signal. Simultaneously, hundreds of people began to speak, not shouting or protesting, but simply talking normally, as if the law of silence had never existed. Mothers spoke with children, neighbors greeted neighbors, and merchants discussed prices. The sound of hundreds of voices speaking simultaneously after years of silence was overwhelmingly powerful. The guards, trained to deal with individual violators, became completely confused about how to respond to a collective and coordinated violation. They couldn't arrest the entire city's population. No, they couldn't mutilate hundreds of people simultaneously. Lord Fox, upon being informed about the event, initially ordered mass executions. However, his own military commanders, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the law's extremes, refused to obey. Some officers secretly sympathized with the resistance, having lost friends and family to the regime's brutality. Within days, Fox's government entered complete collapse. Officials abandoned their posts. Guards deserted. Lord Fox himself, facing the possibility of capture and trial for his crimes, fled the city during the night, taking only the treasures he could carry. The formal revocation of the law of silence happened during an extraordinary assembly where, for the first time in years, citizens could speak freely about their experiences and demands. The new provisional government, led by a coalition of merchants and artisans, immediately abolished all penalties related to verbal expression and established a compensation fund for the law's victims. However, the legacy of mutilation remained. Hundreds of people had permanently lost their tongues and faced the rest of their lives with severe communication disabilities. Efforts were made to develop rehabilitation techniques, including standardized gesture systems and accelerated writing methods, but nothing could completely restore what had been lost. More profoundly, society had to deal with the psychological scars left by years of terror. Many people continued speaking in whispers, long after the law had been revoked, conditioned by fear of being heard. Children who had grown up under the regime needed years of therapy to develop normal communication skills. Trust between neighbors, once destroyed, took decades to rebuild. The history of the law of silence offers profound and terrifying lessons about the nature of authoritarianism, the value of freedom of expression, and the methods by which societies can resist extreme oppression. These lessons resonate particularly in our modern era, where technology and political polarization create new risks for fundamental communication rights. The first and most obvious lesson is about the central role that freedom of expression plays in maintaining a healthy and functional society. The experience of Silentopolis demonstrated that when people cannot communicate freely, not only does democracy die, but the entire social structure begins to deteriorate. Commerce becomes inefficient, education loses its effectiveness, personal relationships fragment, and innovation disappears. The story also reveals how authoritarian regimes often begin with seemingly reasonable justifications. Lord Fox didn't present his law as an act of tyranny, but as a necessary measure to maintain order and security. This is a familiar tactic. Dictators rarely openly admit their objectives of total control, preferring to frame their actions as protection of the common good. The lesson here is that we must be eternally vigilant when governments propose restrictions on freedom of expression, even when presented as temporary or limited. Another crucial aspect revealed by the story is how systems of oppression depend on the participation, voluntary or forced, of ordinary citizens. The law of silence couldn't have been implemented by just a small governing elite. It required an extensive network of informants, spies, and collaborators who came from the population itself. This reality forces us to examine our own propensity to collaborate with unjust systems when offered incentives or when motivated by fear. The resistance organized by the women of Silentopolis offers valuable lessons about how oppression can be fought even in the most extreme circumstances. Their strategy of using apparently mundane activities for secret communication demonstrates the importance of creativity and adaptability in the fight against authoritarianism. It also highlights how groups marginalized or ignored by established power can have unique advantages in organizing resistance. The historical experience of other regions that managed to avoid implementing similar laws provides insights about prevention. Cities that maintained traditions of open public debate, even during periods of political instability, proved more resilient against authoritarian attempts. Institutions like citizen assemblies, free press traditions, and cultures of critical questioning served as effective barriers against the suppression of freedom of expression. The parallels with our modern era are simultaneously obvious and disturbing. While we don't face threats of physical mutilation for our words, we live in an age where digital surveillance allows monitoring of communications on a scale that Lord Fox never could have imagined. Algorithms can detect and analyze our conversations, text messages, and social media posts, creating detailed profiles of our thoughts and opinions. The growing tendency of cancel culture and political polarization also echoes some aspects of the law of silence, while the consequences are social and economic rather than physical. The effect of silencing people for expressing controversial opinions can create an environment where self-censorship becomes normative. The crucial difference is that in democratic societies, these mechanisms arise primarily from social pressure rather than government mandates. But the end result, people afraid to express their genuine thoughts, can be similarly harmful too. Healthy public discourse. Modern technology offers both opportunities and risks for freedom of expression. Digital platforms allow marginalized voices to reach global audiences, but also enable governments to monitor and censor communications with unprecedented efficiency. The experience of Silentopolis reminds us that the technical capacity to suppress communication, once developed, can be quickly expanded and abused. The constant surveillance mentioned in the story finds disturbing parallels in modern government. Programs of data collection and digital monitoring are justified as national security measures. These programs create infrastructure that could be easily adapted for political suppression if circumstances changed. The lesson is that we should be cautious about allowing governments to develop extensive surveillance capabilities. Even when we trust current leaders' intentions, the importance of preserved memory cannot be underestimated. The history of the law of silence was documented by courageous survivors who risked their lives to record events for future generations. These records became fundamental for educating subsequent societies about the dangers of extreme authoritarianism. In our digital age, we have both more opportunities and more responsibilities to document and preserve evidence of injustices so that historical lessons aren't lost. Memorials to the victims of the law of silence were established not just to honor those who suffered, but also to serve as concrete reminders of the costs of lost freedom. These memorials include not just victims' names, but also recordings of their voices made before the law's implementation, creating a powerful contrast between the life and death of human expression. Preserving this history faced significant challenges. Some survivors were reluctant to speak about their experiences, too traumatized to relive painful memories. Others feared that telling their stories might somehow bring back the terror they had experienced. It required a coordinated effort by historians, psychologists, and community leaders to create safe, free environments where survivors could share their testimonies. The importance of remembering in order not to repeat became the guiding principle for education about this period. Schools in neighboring regions began including the history of the law of silence in their curricula, using it as a case study about the dangers of extreme authoritarianism. These educational lessons emphasized not just the historical events, but also the warning signs that preceded the law's implementation and the strategies that proved effective in resistance. We arrive at the end of a journey through one of the darkest pages of human history, an era when the fundamental right to speak was transformed into a crime punishable by mutilation. The history of Silentopoulos' law of silence confronts us with uncomfortable truths about our human nature and about the fragility of freedoms we often take for granted. This extreme narrative forces us to reflect on fundamental questions that resonate in our own era. In a world where algorithms monitor our words, where political polarization creates pressure for self-censorship, and where governments around the world implement increasingly sophisticated forms of surveillance, the lessons of Silentopoulos acquire a disturbing and urgent relevance. The brutality of the law of silence may seem impossible to imagine in our modern era, but history teaches us that civilized societies can quickly descend into extreme authoritarianism when certain conditions align: fear, political instability, and the promise of security in exchange for freedom created the perfect environment for Lord Fox to implement his draconian policies. Ask yourself, would you be able to recognize the warning signs if they began appearing in your own society? Would you have the courage to resist when resistance became dangerous? Would you protect others' right to speak, even when you profoundly disagreed with what they were saying? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're real dilemmas that each generation must confront. The courageous resistance led by Katerina Libertas and the other women of Silentopoulos shows us that even in the most oppressive circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to express itself and fight for freedom. Their creativity in using mundane domestic activities for secret communication demonstrates that effective resistance often comes from unexpected places and uses methods that oppressors can't predict or control. Silentopoulos' recovery after the regime's fall was slow and painful, marked by physical and psychological scars that persisted for generations. This reality reminds us that damage caused by extreme authoritarianism can't be easily reversed. Prevention is always preferable to recovery. It's easier to protect existing freedoms than to reconquer them once lost. The appreciation of our ability to speak freely today shouldn't be just an abstract appreciation, but an active commitment to defend this right for everyone. Every word you can say without fear was conquered through the suffering of generations who were forcibly silenced. Every casual conversation, every joke, every expression of love or disagreement represents a victory over those who sought to control human thought through terror. Modern technologies have created both new opportunities and new risks for freedom of expression. We have the capacity to reach global audiences with our ideas, but we also live under levels of surveillance that would be unimaginable to previous generations. The lesson of Silentopolis is that we must remain eternally vigilant about how these tools are used and by whom. The preserved memory of this terrible history serves as a vaccine against the authoritarian impulses that exist in all societies. By understanding how extremes can be reached, we can better recognize and resist the first steps in that direction. Education about these historical events isn't just academic hits, practical necessity for maintaining free societies. In the end, the history of the law of silence reminds us that freedom of expression isn't just a political right, but a fundamental necessity of human existence. Without the capacity to communicate our thoughts, feelings, and ideas, we lose not just our political voice, but our very humanity. Every word you can say today is a testament to victory over those who tried to silence the human spirit. As we conclude this journey through history's darkest pages, take with you not just the horror of what was, but also the inspiration of what can be when courageous people stand up against oppression. The voice you possess today was conquered through the sacrifice of countless people who refused to be silenced. Thank you for accompanying me on this deep exploration of one of the most extreme laws ever implemented in human history. If this story touched you, share your reflections in the comments. Leave your like to support our work and subscribe so you don't miss our next episodes, where we'll continue exploring the most fascinating and terrifying corners of human experience. In the next episode, we'll dive into another equally extraordinary story about the extreme limits of human power and resistance. Until then, value every word you can say freely, and always remember, forced silence is the death of the human soul, but chosen silence can be the birth of wisdom.